Let's try that again. Hello, my name is Bret. Hopefully the audio is working. This is my show, and this week I thought I'd do another focus on Q&A, basically topics du jour. Everything about my courses. If you're in the middle of my courses, great. You can ask questions here. It's sort of a shortcut to getting those Q&As answered in the course Q&A, which we work on every day. Thanks to my TAs. And, sometimes we talk about things that aren't in my courses, which, obviously I only have 4 courses. I'm not an amazing course creator like some of them on Udemy that have 30 courses. Wish I could do that. I haven't figured out how to do that yet. And keep the quality high and actually know what I'm talking about. I'm just not smart enough to know all 30 topics as well as an instructor might need to know them. So anyway, this is my live show. If you're new to this, if you haven't been to one of these before, thank you so much for being here. I'm here every Thursday. And in case you didn't know how to follow what's going on here and, some of the events and the things that I launch and all that stuff, you can go check me out on Patreon. It's basically a way that you can, most importantly, follow anything I'm creating or releasing. You just have to click that follow button there on patreon.com. Links down below in the description. If you go to the bretfisher.com or the bret.live, you'll see stuff about that there as well. So you can just follow here and you get a private stream of the things that I'm creating, launching, new videos, new people I'm interviewing, stuff like that. If you would like to buy me a coffee or get some exclusive benefits, you're welcome to do that. And I totally appreciate all of my patrons today. And thank you so much for keeping this show, the YouTube live, the podcast that comes out of this YouTube live show, which I'm currently working with an editor. We're working out a new process that will hopefully make that podcast more consistent and more better clips, better little short edits of that stuff. So stay tuned for that. I know it's taken way too long on the podcast to get that thing back up and running. We just had some problems making it easy to ship podcasts, which is really what this is all about. Is like how much can I do in a little amount of time? Because we do newsletters, we do podcasts, we do this YouTube live show. I have consulting clients. I have the 400 plus videos in my courses that I have to keep up to date, and I'm trying to do it all. So thank you so much for your patience. I know some of you are going to ask about course updates, and those are coming. We work on those. In fact, yesterday we were working on those again. We were working on the Udemy stuff, and you hopefully will see something. I just don't know the date. I say soon, but I don't know what that really means anymore. So we're just trying to get you the best stuff in the courses without sacrificing quality, and that takes some time. So apologies for the delays on those videos. All right, so today we're all about Q&A topics that you bring up, and the very first one at the top was Mike. Hello, Mike, in chat saying, what app site do most patrons watch this session? Well, from this video, I'd say 98% of everybody's on YouTube. So I started on YouTube. I was there originally. I had a Twitch channel for a while that I wasn't using, and I would maybe do some live streaming while I was working on Twitch. But the more and more those companies converge on the same idea, the more I think it doesn't really matter where you watch it. It's just whatever you like to do. And I'm also on Periscope, Periscope is going away and getting replaced by Twitch, or by Twitter Live, I guess they're going to call it. I'm not sure what they're going to call it, but it's just going to be Twitter now instead of Periscope. I keep waiting for that to happen because Periscope was never a great platform to begin with. They didn't add a lot of features. So I prefer YouTube just because that's where I learn and watch so many videos all day. So that's just me. Could you please explain a little bit on the scenario of Kubernetes depreciating Docker as developers? What should we do or learn? So thank you, Upam or Upam. Sorry if I mispronounced that name. Charlie answered that pretty well. Essentially, we go to the browser. I answered that months back when it was announced. We had a whole show on it, including Docker's CTO, Justin Cormack. He got a promotion recently. Congrats, Justin. And I'm going to put this into chat. K8. There was a live show all about that. You can watch that whole thing. We go into great detail on what it really means. And like Charlie said, for you, most developers, does not make a hill of beans difference, because whatever Kubernetes distribution you're using already decided which runtime it was using, and it will stick with that, or it will change it, and it's, you'll just have to follow instructions when the day comes. Doesn't mean anything about compatibility. It doesn't affect, any of our day-to-day stuff. It's really just a component change inside the tool chain of Kubernetes. This was all planned years ago. We're just now getting to that point where Docker has separated out parts of its engine, sort of creating a little bit of a microservice architecture, although it's not really to that level. But they're splitting out functionality, putting those into separate binaries, and now Kubernetes doesn't need the entire Docker binary daemon to do its job. It needs something smaller called containerd. So not really that big of a deal, but it was presented as a big deal to the community by various people, and I wanted to do a whole show to clear it up that it's news, it's interesting, but it's not news. So yeah, go check that out. I think it's interesting. I think it's relevant. If you have to run clusters, if that's your job to run Kubernetes clusters, then you probably have already known about all this stuff. But the rest of us, Docker is still Docker. It's still fully compatible. We all use standards now. There's a standard image format. There's a standard registry format. Like all these things have standards that help us allow all these tools to work together. So yeah. Let's see. Next up. Okay. Matt asks, I'm struggling to find means of how to use swarm secrets in a Docker file. Is this possible? No. So that's a great question. So just like with Kubernetes and the same with Swarm, it's hard to conceptualize when you're first starting out what is in an image and what isn't. So in an image, we're talking about the application and its dependencies, but secrets, just like configs, or in Kubernetes they're config maps, secrets and configs are environment-specific things. They're not something that is typically the same everywhere you put it, whether it's dev, test, prod, these are all different places that you would put the app. And so those things like secrets and configs were specifically pulled out, one, because we don't want secrets in our image. It's kind of like storing passwords in your Git repo, right? We just know we're not supposed to do that. And so images are not encrypted. They're not stored on a registry encrypted by default. So you wouldn't want to put secrets there in the image. So configs and secrets, being that they're environment specific, they're what I would consider a runtime setting. So images are build time. That's when you're building your software and all of its dependencies into this tarball that's shipped around the internet. And then you have runtime dependencies like an orchestrator or volume mappings or secrets or configs. Those are all things, or maybe CPU and memory reservations or restrictions, limits. Those are all things that they're not in the Docker file. Those are not concerns of build time. Those are concerns of runtime. And those settings may change based on the environment. So it's important to think about build time versus runtime. Now, there are a few things, to be fair, in the Docker file that are only concerns of runtime. The run command is a build time, ironically. It's not a runtime, it's a build time command. So run, right? Or the env, that can be sometimes used in the Docker file during build time. And the cmd at the very end, it's added in as a metadata object at build time. But technically the cmd and the entry point, those two particular Docker file commands, are only executed at runtime. So it's interesting to think about how the Docker file and the Docker image it's mostly build time stuff, but there are a few things in it. You don't specify anything about secrets or configs in there. What you may do is you probably need to worry about setting up your application so that they can read from that secret. If it's in Swarm, it's going to be an environment variable. So your app needs to know how to deal with that secret at runtime. So what you might do is simply for your container to work and maybe a sample setting, you might set up an environment variable in your Docker file that has sort of a default, but it's something that you would never use in production. You would always overwrite that with a real secret in production. Anyway, we can go down that road with a different question if you have more questions, but that answers that, hopefully. Let's see. Anton, I wonder, is there any way to limit resources used by Docker Engine and WSL2 in large compose files? Still struggling with memory release after container being removed. Is there any workarounds? Limit resources used by Docker Engine and WSL2 in large compose files. I do not know of any way to do that. As far as I know, Docker just uses, Docker's not in control of that. Docker's just essentially running as a daemon, as a systemd service inside that WSL2 VM. So the VM itself and how it is used is entirely up to the WSL2 frameworks, right? So Docker's just acting as a normal Linux thing inside there. There is no, you can't, so when you talk about memory use in Docker, right, you have the daemon itself, And then if you go looking at your processes, you'll see that it's also for every container it starts up container D, and then container D starts run C, and then run C starts the application that you put into the CMD of your Docker file. So all 4 of those are going to be running, and 3 of those are running for each container, right? The container D, the run C, but those tend to be very low memory use things. They're kind of a fixed memory set. They don't really grow over time that I'm aware of. Whereas your application, depending on your application, whether it's, if it's MySQL is designed to use as much memory as you will give it, right? Any persistent database store will eat up all your memory. So at that point, I would say, what containers are you running? Use something inside of your WSL2 like top or CTOP or some of these other, or HTOP, all these top, different Linux programs. If it was me, I would go and use those programs to see the memory usage of what's going on in the background of my entire WSL2 VM. And then I might find that really the memory is being used up by my applications, not by Docker itself, but by the applications Docker's running. And then I would look at how I can limit those applications and their memory usage. You can't necessarily start a container and just say, only allow 1 gig of memory to be used in this container. You can do that, but if you do that and your application wants more than a gig, then it's going to try to use it. It'll get an out-of-memory error, and then it will get killed. So that's not really how you kind of have to rein in the applications. And in Docker, and I guess certain applications might look at their C group reservations and limits that Docker can set, and maybe they would set themselves up appropriately. So that is a thing you could try, but it's very application specific. Like these are application specific things, and something that you need to spend time on if you're going to do this in production. Because in production, if you're going to run databases and other applications, for example, Java used to, up until the recent versions, Java used to use as much memory as it felt like using, regardless of how much Docker or Kubernetes told it to use. So it's very application specific. So if you get very specific on your question, you're like, hey, how do I limit my SQL to only use 500 megs of RAM when it's in my machine? Well, that might be an MySQL very specific setting that you need to set when you're starting up MySQL, maybe with a custom config file that limits its resources so that it doesn't try to consume that in your WSL2. I don't know if that helps. I think last time we talked about all your microservices. So one of the challenges with microservices is you are spinning up a container D and a run C for that application each time. And then, of course, each one of those applications will use a certain amount of memory. So that's, one of the things about microservices is they are not the most efficient way to use memory. It's just not. Spinning up Node 20 times or Python 20 times requires that you spin that up 20 times, right? So that's an inefficiency of microservices. What you gain in microservices is separation of concerns and different teams being able to move at different speeds, all that kind of thing. But one of it is not resource efficiency. Probably mono applications are the most efficient use of memory, if that's your concern, which is why you don't see a lot of microservices being thrown into IoT, right? You don't want 20 different things all separated on a tiny little, CPU with a tiny little amount of RAM. You usually tend to see these more monolithic things there. Anyway, great questions. Good evening. Hello, Martin. Hello, nice to see everyone. Hello, Owen. Niels. Some regulars on the show. Yes, the infamous Soon, Pellin. Well, that might be a good tip. Sudeep is saying about there's a WSL2 config. I've heard of this, but I've not played with it. So I didn't know if it was WSL2 command, like WSL commands, or if it was a config file. So that's cool. You can do that. Oh yeah, and Pickle Rick's talking about remember our Discord server over there, DevOps.fan. That's our Discord server. People chatting away every day on various DevOps topics, including Swarm, Compose, Docker, Kubernetes, Terraform, clouds, all those things, right? DevOps. DevOps practices, developer best practices, all those things. So it's a free server, and you're welcome to join us. You are most welcome, you Pam. Can I replace VMs with Docker for everything? Maybe. I do. I can't cause Docker to run Windows on my Mac, so I do have to run Windows in a VM on my Mac. And that's about it. So yeah, I mean, often people will run Docker in VMs because they don't want to give bare metal. They don't want to have a single OS on bare metal yet. But I think that what Docker does is allows us to decide, do we want a bunch of VMs on the same piece of hardware, or do we want that single piece of hardware with only one operating system, and then we do bare metal Docker? That's certainly possible too. I've seen teams do that. You get much better performance out of it that way, much better utilization of resources, but you have to have all the right tooling. Most of us have spent the last 15 years designing all of our tooling around VMware, right? Managing virtual machines, deploying virtual machines with images. So going back to booting to the network with your net boot on your hardware was not something that we were planning for in this new future, but that's now possible because if you think about it, VMs were the isolation layer. They were the reason we would put one app in a VM, one app in that VM, one app in that VM. And so the VM itself became this very heavyweight isolation layer for how we isolate our stuff. Now, Docker images are the way to go. That's the new standard that's used across all of the cloud native world. So all the new cloud native tooling, including Docker and Kubernetes, they're all assuming that you use the image format, the OCI format for that. So that's what I use in all my projects, and all of my customers they're all moving to that part of the tooling where they're standardizing on the image format, which means they're running it in a container runtime of some sort. Maybe it's containerd, maybe it's Docker, maybe it's something else. Maybe it's cryo. Let's see, Visual. Sorry for mispronouncing that. Thank you for creating a wonderful course on Docker. My question is how to enable VTX and AMD-V on Azure Linux Ubuntu machines for Docker machine nodes. I am not aware that you can. I'm not the expert on this, but as I last checked, but that was maybe a year ago, the only way you could do that was on a Windows machine in Azure. That may now be possible on Linux, on a Linux machine, but I'm not sure that you can. So if you don't find it on their documentation, then maybe it's not possible. But I'm not the right person to really ask because I'm not up to date on that. So one thing you can do is, I mean, they obviously have forums, but Microsoft also has their own Discord server where you can ask other Azure community experts. So go looking for that. If you just kind of Google Microsoft Discord community, you'll find their chat server on Discord that's run by a lot of great community people. And hopefully you can find some help there. Is the M1 MacBook Air 8 gigabit RAM model good for Docker and Kubernetes? I would never use an 8 gig anything. If you can afford the MacBook Air, get the 16 gig. Just even though it may take longer to get it. Everyone I've seen who had the 8 gig wish they had the 16, regardless of whether they do Docker or not. So I have you can't see it, but I have a M1 Mini over in the corner, and I got the 16 gig model, and I'm very happy with it. It performs quite well for an early system. The only issue I have in my workflow is that the Google Drive app, the file sync apps for Google, they don't work on it yet, and we're probably having to wait a couple of months for those. So there's a couple of apps out there that don't quite work. Parallels is still in beta. Docker's version of M1 is still in beta. So if you're looking for stability, it's not the place to be. But even though we have the optimized RAM in M1, what did I get? They have a term for it that's not optimized, but basically the sharing of the RAM. But as soon as you spin up that Docker VM, which it's still going to have to spin up a VM, right? It's going to have to spin up a little ARM VM in the background. There's going to be more memory usage, right? And then all the apps are going to run in there. You're going to run 3 or 4 apps. Like there's at least gigs of memory that's going to be used just by Docker. And then, of course, all browsers today use gigs of RAM just using them. So it would be tough. It's not that you couldn't do it, but if you're going to spend that much money, just spend that little bit more and get twice the memory, and it'll last longer. It'll perform better longer over time. Plus, there's tons of YouTube videos about people saying they're returning the 8 gig and getting the 16. So. Jeremy's asking about persistent volume content in the Kubernetes mastery course. Yes, that is indeed the next section that's coming up. Right now, what we are doing is we're fixing videos that are out of date or don't necessarily work with the current versions of the products. So Docker Desktop now has WSL2, Kubernetes is now 120, and there's some command line differences. So I'm working on all that, and then as soon as that's done, we're going straight to that section in Kubernetes mastery. So I don't have a date because it depends on an entire team of people and our availability, but we are actively working on that every week. Not all week because we have all these other things to do, but I'm sorry that is delayed. That I should have had that done last year, but I don't know. The pandemic threw some curveballs last year that caused us to get really backed up in our video production. So that's coming. Yes, hang on there. It'll be here. And thanks for sticking with it. Sorry for the delays. I think this is, I have a PHP web app. Paul says, we need to trigger a cron job to run each night that hits a PHP file and does some housekeeping. Should we have a separate container just running cron? Any other ideas? Okay, so you have a PHP web app in Docker. My first question is, what is it? Docker? Is it Docker Swarm? Is it Kubernetes? Like, what is it? So a lot of these tools all now have built-in cron management. Swarm has a job runner, but doesn't have the cron runner. So if Crazy Max is around, Crazy Max might tell you that he makes a Swarm add-on that allows you to do cron-like stuff. So in other words, my advice is don't build it into the container. Like nowadays, with whatever we're running containers on, there tends to be a solution, a tool out there, whether it's built-in or third-party, that will run your containers on a schedule so that you don't have to put cron in a container, which I've done. I've had to do that in the past because it was the only viable option at the time. But I feel like we've moved beyond that. Kubernetes has had it built in for a while. Swarm has lots of third-party options as well as this new partially finished built-in option that it does jobs, which means as soon as you tell it to run it, it'll run it, but it doesn't schedule it. It's half the solution. So I would look at that stuff first before you go putting cron in a container. Now, there is nothing wrong with putting cron in a container. In fact, in my examples, I don't even use cron. I use just a bash for each loop with a seconds delay, right? So in a very simplistic example that works on every version and everything of Docker, I do a nightly, I show this all the time. So if you've seen this show before, you've probably seen this. I do a nightly prune, and it can be in a compose file. It could be just a Docker line, but all it is a container that runs the Docker image, and then I bind mount the host socket. What that means is that allows the Docker commands in my container to control the host Docker daemon. This is actually fine. You read a lot of sensational stuff on the internet about insecure, don't ever do this. This is fine. I'm not exposing this to the internet. This is not publicly exposed in any way. It is simply a way for me to take an administrative task and containerize it. Doesn't make it any less secure than doing it on the host. All right. So I'm doing this, and then I just override the default command and say, hey, instead of running the default command of a Docker image, which I'm assuming it runs Docker, I don't know, just give me a bash loop. It's actually just an sh loop, not really using bash. It's using sh here, and it says, hey, while true, do a Docker image prune of every image I have that wasn't downloaded in the last 24 hours, and then sleep for a day worth of seconds, and it just repeats that over and over again. Now, one of the challenges here is that when the container goes away, the logging goes away. There's just some things that a cron scheduler would be more intuitive if I could do it. If I had a bunch of these, it's not super obvious when you're looking at all your containers that some of them are cron jobs, right? That's one of the challenges with this method is you have to kind of dig in, inspect it, and see what the actual override command is before you know how often it's running. It's that kind of problem, right? Whereas if you have like a Kubernetes cron job, you can actually look at that type of resource and see all of them and their schedules very clearly in the command line. So it's much more obvious what's happening when, what they're running. Here, it's kind of hidden. And so it's not ideal, but it does work. All right. Any chance for a tutorial on taking an app and creating a complete pipeline from the dev push through build and test to deploy to a staging environment in Kubernetes, perhaps in AWS? So that is a dream of mine. I feel like I need to finish the feature stuff first before I start showing examples of full pipelines. What have been trying to do is ask other people to be on this show, which we have done before. In the last year, we've had multiple people on. Victor Farsick has been one, I think. I could be remembering wrong. But try to have other people come on, especially those that have their own, they're at companies that are CI platforms, and talk about how they would recommend you do it if you were interested in using their tool. Because at the end of the day, all these pipelines, you just have to choose tools. And there's so many tools to choose from. The challenge is, how do I make one that's universal? There is no way for me to make a universally accepted, this is code on my Git repo somewhere, and this is my server somewhere, and you make all the magic happen in the middle. Like there's 100 choices that have to be made there. So what I would love to do is, honestly, someday is have a course where I give 2 or 3 examples that are using the most popular tools. Doesn't mean they're the best. It just means the most popular. For example, Jenkins, it's not something that I would ever deploy unless I absolutely had to. I would prefer not to use Jenkins. It's just not the future tool that I'm looking to use. But I love GitOps, so I would love to see a GitOps pipeline that's purely GitHub, GitOps, and maybe using EKS, right? That would be a very simplistic example using probably the most popular cloud, the most popular code hosting platform, and then some simple CI tool in the middle like GitHub Actions. So I do want to do that. What we have had on the show in the last year, go back into the YouTube lives, that's up here. We had we had several GitOps people on in the last year or so that talked through this. We've had CI, I think maybe not 2020, maybe even 2019. I had some CI company tooling on, and we've had Nginx. We've talked about that. We've had guests from Flux. We've talked about Argo on the show. We've had Victor coming in talking about Argo. So we've talked a lot about this stuff. Yeah, but I haven't given an end-to-end example in a single place. And that's a thing I'd love to do. It's just time. So maybe what we need to have a guest on the show that can walk us through an entire pipeline that they made up and how they did it. And then we can talk about the pros and cons of it. If any of you have that and you'd like to be a guest on the show, send me on Twitter, whatever, however you want to send it to me. Send it to me, your open source examples, because this this all should be based on open source, right? So we can all learn from it. So send me those examples, and you can come on the show and show it off. That would be fun. All right. Challenge given. Will the challenge be accepted? Let's see. Hello from Ukraine. Hey, Ivan. I make courses. Links down below. Coupons and links. I recommend my courses. There are many courses out there. All of them are, well, not all of them. Many of them are good. I have not watched any of them. So the only one I can recommend is the one that I made, which you can get below. Or go to my website, which is a link above. You can see that, bretfisher.com. And thanks for coming to the show. Cape Town, what's up? Iran. All good people. Belgium, Martin, hello. What's with everyone moving to Discord recently away from Slack? Well, you can still join my Slack, which you can get at bretfisher.com. You can get it as part of any of my courses. I still have 32,000 people signed up in my Slack community. However, Slack is only designed for trusted teams. It is not for open communities. People use it that way, but the Slack company has specifically said this is a tool for trusted teams. For example, you cannot block anyone. You cannot ban someone. There's no community management. It's hard to make different groups and roles like moderators and people that have speaking ability but not They can read, but they can't write kind of thing. Like it's really hard to do that, if not impossible, especially in a free Slack account. Discord, totally built for that. Totally designed for open communities and doesn't require you to pay any money to get forever messaging that stays around forever and search that always searches everything back in time. Like those are all things that just come out of the box free with Discord. So plus it's fun. It's kind of fun. Improve security in Docker for DevSecOps. So yes, there is actually, I don't have a course. I don't know of a course. What I can recommend to you is a book by Liz Rice. And Liz Rice just launched it this year, and she was on my show. She launched it last year, and she was on my show last year talking about it. So let's see, Container Security book. It's called Container Security, Fundamental Technology Concepts that Projects Containerized Applications, blah, 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 right? And you should check that out. I have not read it, but I have watched her talk many times on container security. She works at one of the most well-known container security companies, and she has some of the best talks out there, and she is a great member of the community, great leader in the community. So I would always recommend anything she does, because I know she doesn't put out garbage. She puts out great work that she works really hard on. So I feel confident in recommending that book without reading it. I wouldn't do that for very many people, but definitely for Liz. So if you're looking to up your game in container security, and especially the latest security stuff, because she wrote it, she shipped it over in the last year, so it's a relatively recent thing. There are other books probably out there, but they may be 3 or 4 years old, which doesn't necessarily mean they're bad. But we have new things, like in Kubernetes, we have new features that we didn't have 3 years ago for security. Anyway, and I'm not sure if her book actually goes into Kubernetes. It may just talk about fundamentals of a container. But that's a great question, ASAM. Yeah, Paul's right. Nobody ever said, "I wish I had less RAM." Yeah, you will. Your machine will always last longer, and its life will always be extended by more RAM. You can get by with a slow CPU for a lot of years, but RAM, to me, honestly, at the end of the day, RAM and hard drive speed were always the reasons I replaced computers, not so much CPU. Do I have any? Do you have any courses that go through setting up staging servers and those types of DevOps workflows? No, I don't. So the advice I can give you is, if you're looking to set up servers, one, do everything you can to avoid setting up servers. Just get out of that game. If you're going to use Kubernetes, use Fargate with EKS. Or if you're on DigitalOcean, use DigitalOcean's new Kubernetes deployment option. If you're on Google, use Google Cloud Run if you can. If you can use Lambdas and functions as a service or serverless, do that. Because servers, we are, over the next 10 years, as we have been doing for the last 5 years or so, we are all trying to get away from managing servers. We used to manage data centers. The cloud took that away from a lot of people. Some people still need to run data centers, that's fine. But for a lot of us, we never needed that in the first place. But we had to, if you remember, wasn't that long ago, if you wanted to run a bunch of servers on the internet, you didn't want to run a Bluehost or something like that, you either had to pay rack space or someone a lot of money, or you had to go find a data center, rent a half rack or a quarter rack, go buy servers and slide them in there, and you had to care about all your stuff, right? So the same thing is happening to the operating system. The cloud is removing the need for us to manage operating systems. So Heroku did that almost 10 years ago, and we've been expanding on that concept ever since. So my first advice is, see how you can not use servers. Go as far as you can with not using servers and using all the other options you have in your cloud of choice, avoiding deploying servers. Secondly, if you have to deploy servers, learn Terraform. Like Terraform has, in my world, it is now the standard way, regardless of where you are, regardless of what platform you're on, for creating VMs and deploying servers in the cloud. Now, if you're in a data center, you're probably going to be using VMware tools rather, but you may still be able to use Terraform there. I tend to prefer Terraform over Ansible. I think Terraform is a little more forward-looking into how infrastructure as code should work, and so it's not that Ansible isn't possible. It's just everyone I know really that I work with as a consultant, or anyone who's a Docker captain, they're all Terraform people. So we use Terraform when we have to, but again, we prefer not to run servers if we don't have to. So learn Terraform. Find a course on Terraform. I don't have one yet. I don't have one. I'm not the guru of Terraform, but I do use it, and I do use it in projects. And then when I don't need it anymore, I get rid of it. If I have some automated tool that spins up servers because it's a part of a Fargate cluster or something, then I don't have to run Terraform anymore, unless I want to use Terraform to create my Fargate. In that case, in those situations, you might use EKS-CTL, which is also a really cool tool for spinning up Fargate or EKS clusters without having to use Terraform. Pretty neat. EKS-CTL. Check it out. And Marco says, yeah, do you have any courses on Terraform? Nope, not yet. I've actually bought other people's Terraform courses on Udemy just to see if I could solve some quick problems with buying a course and watching some videos. So, okay, Paul, your PHP container is running in Swarm. Yeah, so I would look up Crazy Max Swarm jobs or something like that. Try that one first. Yep, there it is. Just had it. Oh, he's Crazy Dash Max. So check out this. It's an add-on for Swarm. Basically, it runs as containers. And that might help you. I've seen people use the Docker Swarm health check as a hack for cron-like behavior. What? Not recommending that. That's actually a pretty cool hack. I can see how you would use that and just have it fail after a certain amount of time, and then it would gracefully shut down your container and restart it. That's actually really interesting. Yeah, I recommend not doing that. Yeah, I think I like the bash method, but yeah, just because then you'd have to look at the health check command to figure out. And one of the problems is always, all of those things like the health check, maybe you can design it to stop working at a specific time of day. That's probably a little bit better. My problem with the one I have is it's based on when you start the container. So it counts down starting when you start the container. So it's not easy for you to say, do it at midnight every day. You have to start the container the first time at midnight. And if you reboot the server, that would have reset that, and so it's not that great. It's really just for a maintenance task. It's for that you don't care when it runs. So if you're running something on a true schedule, that's when I would advise. Yeah, just if you don't have a third-party tool like we just looked at, go put cron in your container and just do it that way. Yeah, and have your CMD be something that you can actually look at that would specify the cron format. I don't have a good example of that, but essentially, you don't want to have to dive in to you don't want to have to dive in to try to figure out and determine when this thing is supposed to run. You want to make it as easy as possible. So, I spitballing on ideas, you might have the cron file as a config, and then you just make a bunch of generic configs. Runs at midnight, runs every hour, and they're generic configs. And then when you mount them into specific containers, you will know that container on inspection is using a specific cron file that you name appropriately or you label it appropriately. That's one way you could do it. But again, we have these better tools now, so I would just use the tools. So. I am stuck with traffic and Docker Swarm, especially with many services. Sorry about that. Let me know if you have a question. Is it a good idea to run a container inside a container? If there are reasons, yes, you can do that. I don't believe it's officially supported, but it's used a lot of cases. It's used for CI a lot. A lot of people are running CI jobs to build or run containers, and their CI is running inside a container. If you've ever used Play with Docker, you're running a container in a container. When you do a Docker run in Play with Docker, you're spinning up a container inside of a Docker daemon that is running inside a container. You don't have an entire host on that system, right? You're just using one small little slice of it in a container. So that works. So yeah, totally. I'd say it's mostly used for CI. I don't see that happening a lot in production. But hello, Francisco. Hello, hello. Um, Bill is asking about macro containers in regard to refactoring monolith applications. I have not heard of uh, macro containers. No, I haven't heard of that term. I'm assuming it's bigger than micro. um, but yes, when I work with teams that are looking to refactor their app, they first containerize the monolith, and then when they want to add a new piece of functionality, they put that in a totally separate app, usually in a separate Git repo, and then it has its own CI pipeline that creates its own image and it deploys as its own container. They also can then choose if they want to go back and refactor. They can take a small portion of that monolith app and basically siphon it out, extract the code, or completely recode it in a different language, maybe, because that's sometimes what they want to do is they want to switch languages, so they're going to take a chunk at a time, and they do it that way. And the argument of micro versus macro versus monolith, like, to me, that's just how a team wants to work. I do not think that micro architectures are like the universal cure-all for everyone. I think it totally depends on your team, on how sophisticated you are, on what your team knows how to do, and your requirements. Because if you're just 3 people and it's a single website, you could microservice that, but you would create a lot of overhead if you're all working together, if you already know how to collaborate, if you're code pairing together, if you're doing all these things in the open together, then not a big deal. But if you have separate teams that are separate, management heads, and they want to move at different speeds and they have different priorities, often I think that applications are architected in a way, whether they're separated or split out into certain different services, they can sometimes be affected by organizational charts. So, the API team is different than the front end team, so they're not the same app and they're separate repos. What I do appreciate and advocate for is when you decide to run your application as a separate part. So even if you're in a single application stack, let's say you're running a PHP app, and then you have PHP workers. You have a PHP API and a PHP bunch of little workers, and they're separate commands. So that can be one image. If it's a single repo, it can be a single image, and you just change the run, or the CMD, the command, so that you're running that same image 10 different times, and it's doing 10 different things in 10 different containers. I have seen that. That is a way that I often will Dockerize a monolith app that is traditionally just running on a single server. That's very common, and I think that's appropriate. That allows you to get to containers before you re-architect your app, because you don't have to re-architect your app to do containers. It's not a requirement. So then after times, they will eventually say, okay, we're going to align all of this stuff. So if we've got 10 images running as 10 containers, but they're coming from a single repo, we can decide to take parts of that repo and make it as a new repo that makes its own new image, that makes its own new container, instead of it all being bundled in one. I am not a huge fan of big monolith repos. When you start talking about separate parts of your app all being developed at different times, and then having to build images from that, and then deploy containers from that, if it's all in a single mono repo, it's very challenging to do that in piecemeal, because CI looks and waits for GitHub, webhooks, and your CI usually kicks off on a webhook. It's not usually intelligent enough to go, oh, you only changed that one file, so I should only rebuild this one image because that's the only image that depends on that one file, and that's the only one I'll replace on the server. It tends to be problematic in terms of determining what changes need to affect which services. And so I much more prefer nowadays the alignment of Git repo to images, so that's a one-for-one relationship. Not all cases, but most cases, so that your CI and your deployments, basically your code, your CI, your CD is all one stream, and then for each image that you want to create, you have its own repo, its own CI, its own CD, its own relationship in your GitOps tooling or whatever. I prefer that clean level of abstraction, but it's not universal. So it's hard without looking at your project to know what to do. How can I join the Discord? The link below the video doesn't work. DevOps.fan, that doesn't work. Let's go see. I'm going to go try it right now. DevOps.fan takes you to that invite screen. So sorry if the link's bad below. I'll check that later. But DevOps.fan takes you to that invite, and then you can if you haven't signed into Discord, be sure you do before you do that, or create an account, because I've gotten confused sometimes, and it actually, if you have an account and you haven't logged in, it will sometimes create a new account for you, and that can be confusing. So anyway, you're welcome, Corey. I'm glad you're learning a ton. Any way to create a kind of AWS local environment in Docker? So it depends. AWS is a company's section of business, not really a product. So it depends on what you're talking about. A lot of AWS services have open source companion apps or simulation apps that basically emulate that same thing in your local environment. You can do that with S3. I know there's other ones that you can do the same thing with. So it depends on which one you're talking about. I would search that specific product. Whatever product, RDS, Redis, you can run Redis, right? Postgres, RDS, Postgres, you can run Postgres locally. If it's an AWS service that they created out of thin air, go look on GitHub, and there's probably an open source project that will let you run that locally without having to create those resources on AWS. Knative is fine. Hello, Peter. Kubeless is fine. Those are all fine tools. OpenFaz is another good one if you don't want to be, if you want to be sort of a little bit more agnostic. Those are all. I don't have a strong opinion about them because their workflows are a little bit different and their functionality is a little bit different, and so it largely depends on your project. And you would have to do your needs assessment essentially and go play with each of those tools to figure out which of them fits your workflow better. I don't know how else to answer that, but they're all ideas about how to do serverless. Traffic or Nginx for load balancing? I tend to not use Nginx for multiple reasons, but I mean, Traffic might be my favorite, but I think long term, I mean, Nginx is one of the defaults, but it requires me to do other things, right? Then I have to load up Cert Manager, because Nginx doesn't help me with certificates out of the box. So with Traffic, I get a lot more out of the box. It also then, though, does have rough edges because it's a freemium product. So you hit limits with it that you maybe want to go farther, but then you have to pay for those. That is true in Nginx as well once you get into enterprise, because Nginx is still the same freemium model where there's a project that's open source and then there's a product with more features that you pay for. One of the things that I get frustrated with in Nginx in large scale, very enterprise solutions is that the metrics that you want to get out of it, you have to pay for the enterprise version to get more metrics out of it. So that can be problematic. There was a project years ago that I actually swapped out Nginx for HA Proxy because HA Proxy had all those metrics for free with the open source version, and Nginx wanted me to pay for it. So but I use Nginx all the time. So it kind of depends on the project and the needs and the team and what they want to go with. They might choose something like Envoy, with something on top of that, because that's sort of a newer project. If they like that model, it's also designed to update things in where Nginx requires that you reload it. Some of these other ones, you can do real time updates to the platform a little bit easier. It just kind of depends. I'm trying to build a GPT-2 container, but struggling with memory problems. Did you ask this question before? I'm not a GPT-2 person, so I don't know. Memory problems. How would I resolve such a problem? So memory problems are usually in your app, and they're not related to Docker. Like Docker doesn't change how your app uses memory. So Docker itself, if you use it in a normal way, it behaves the same way in memory usage, and it's not usually it's not the problem. It's almost always the containers app that you're running. So I would say that that's very specific to your app. So use something like CTOP, HTOP, or TOP, or any of the other memory tools out there. Those are the simple ones that give you a nice little GUI to understand and profile your application and its memory usage. Because it's probably not Docker doing that. Matt, the answer to that best practice to build a database and app, always have them separate. Never put them in the same container. I haven't seen a single legitimate reason to do that for a long time now. So, um, how do you find vulnerabilities in a Docker container? Any open source software? Yes. Look up Tivy. So, Trivy, actually, not Tivy. So GitHub/Aqua Security/Trivy is one. You can do that. That is, I think, one of the best open source ones. There's Claire and other ones. There's lots of options. You can also look up Sneak. Sneak is an option. They have an open source, and you can get certain scans for free. So go check them out. Those are the two that I know the best. And in some of my courses, some of my YouTube examples and examples on GitHub use both of those. So you can go check those out. Specifically, I don't think it's in. I think it's in my DockerCon 2019 talk. So if you just look up Bret, go to GitHub and look up DockerCon 19. I have a repo there as well that I believe I have some scanning examples in here. It might use Trivy and it might use an older one known as Microscanner. I also think I used that in my Node.js course. So Microscanner is kind of an older one, but now Trivy and Sneak are my two go-to options. All right, I hope that helps. But yeah, you scan it. Or you can put it on Docker Hub and pay Docker Hub like $3 or $5 a month, and they will scan your images with Sneak. And you can it's just automated for you. So you can do that. Let's see. How do I find vulnerabilities? By the way, you get some of that for free. I forgot to mention, you can sign up for Docker Hub for free and actually get some Sneak scans for free too. They announced that last year. So go check that out. It's built into the Docker command line, so that you can actually do it without even downloading Sneak. If you're using Docker Desktop. If I use Podman as a container as a service, can I use K8s as cluster option? Is it compatible? No. Podman is not a Kubernetes runtime. That is what Cryo is for. If you're in the Red Hat ecosystem, Podman uses systemd as your daemon to run containers. And whenever you create a new container, it will spin up a new systemd service to do that. And it is meant really for a single host. And it's, in my opinion, it's meant for use by humans, right? You would type the commands as a human. So it's great if your Linux is your host OS, or if you have a single Linux server and you don't want to use Docker, you'd rather use Podman. It's one half dozen of the other. When you want to go to Kubernetes, you're most likely going to have containerd as the underlying container runtime. But if you wanted to stick with the Red Hat route and use something like OpenShift, you will use Cryo, which is a subset of the features of containerd that's specifically designed for Kubernetes. Like Cryo's only goal is really to be a Kubernetes runtime. So it's nice and focused, very much with that Red Hat alignment of small tools doing one job approach, which is why Podman and Builda are separate tools. So if you like that approach, you can do that. But largely, you don't really care about your runtime in Kubernetes. Like, you can have Podman running containers that are just one-off containers, and then Kubernetes running Cryo for you. But you're not going to interface with Cryo or containerd. You're going to use the Kubernetes kube control command, right? You're going to use those commands, or the Helm command or something like that. That's how you're going to interface with Kubernetes, not with the runtime commands. The runtime is really just something that Kubernetes will use on your behalf. And the only time you have to really care about it is when everything goes to crap and you have to troubleshoot. So it is nice to know about them, but you don't normally use them day to day. But those are great questions. How do you recommend or rate container tools? I use Docker everywhere that a human needs to use containers. When I need servers to run containers, I tend to use Kubernetes, or in very small projects, I'll use, Swarm as built-in of Docker. But over the years, as Kubernetes has gotten easier, and I've gotten more familiar with it, and it's got better tooling and all these third-party tools that are just cropping up everywhere for servers, I tend to default now to Kubernetes. So I still run a lot of stuff on Swarm. So those two things are there. I don't use Podman. I don't use Cryo because I don't use OpenShift. Cryo, I don't know anyone that's using Cryo outside of OpenShift. Because Containerd tends to be the default there, and it has more functionality. So I would, recommend that one. And Podman, I run Mac, so I need something like Docker Desktop. Podman, if I were to use Podman on a Mac, I would have to manage my own VMs and then like go into them and do Podman inside them, or set up, that whole systemd service thing. It's just more work. So I don't want to do all that work, and so I just run Docker Desktop because it's easy. But if you're on Linux as a major system and you don't want to run the Docker daemon for whatever reason, Podman would be my preference. That would be the first thing I'd go look at if I was just on a single server running containers. Let's see. Do I have any courses on CI/CD? I do not. I'd love to, but I have not made one yet. Yep. That's a good point, Eric. Kind is also another containers and containers. It's a way to run Kubernetes inside Docker. So you're running containers and containers. Great. I forgot about that one. Thank you. Should I use Helm charts utilizing GKE, or should I build individual Docker images like I have 10 strongly coupled with GitLab CI pipeline with AWS ECR? I don't understand the question, Vidang. Sorry if I mispronounced your name, but to me, you have to have images to use anything, whether it's Helm or not. Helm uses images, Kubernetes uses images, Docker uses images. They all use the same OCI spec. So you have to create those images first, which means you have to learn Docker files, build your images, or use someone else's images. And then whether or not you use Kubernetes manifest, customize, or Helm, or something else, whether or not you use those types of formats, it's totally up to you. I would start out by just using Kubernetes YAML. Just learn that. And then once you've learned that, choose whether you want to learn Customize with a K, which is the built-in templating tool, or Helm, which is another templating tool. And you don't have to go those routes. If you're on a simple environment and it's a small team where it's just you don't have to go Helm if you don't want. Now you can use Helm to deploy other people's software really easily, but you can mix or match. You can have some things in Helm. You can have some things that are just Kubernetes manifest. It's totally up to you. But I would start with the manifest because that's the underlying thing that you should eventually understand well, and then you're going to build a Helm chart on top of that to help. Essentially in the background, it's creating those manifests for you, right? So I always try to learn tools from the bottom up when I can, and learn the underpinnings of it and the understandings of it, so that I know what's happening when I do something like Helm. And there's other tools, Rio. There's tons of ways to deploy Kubernetes workloads, and it doesn't have to be Helm, but Helm tends to be the tool of choice. I'd still recommend Docker Swarm for production. If you were starting a brand new project now, probably not. If you were a single person running a couple of websites for your own hobby, yes, that's what I do. Simple. If I don't know Kubernetes yet, I don't want to have to go learn it just to run a website, so Swarm is easy, right? Swarm gets into problems nowadays when you need to run tons of servers, hundreds of servers, or thousands of workloads. There's a limit to its performance, and there's not a lot of third-party tooling to support all the things you'll want to do eventually, like fancy persistent storage or fancy networking. As you get more complicated, Swarm it has limits, right? It only does so much. And so, for example, if you want to run a cron job in it, you have to go get a third-party tool for that, whereas with Kubernetes has it built in. So it's just a question of how simple are your needs, how little are your resources, because one of the nice things about Swarm is it runs really well on a Raspberry Pi. It doesn't use very much memory beyond just Docker itself. It's very performant, whereas if you've ever run Kubernetes, you know that right out of the box, it's going to use anywhere between 5 and 25% of your CPUs to just start. So it just kind of depends. But yeah, I'd say for business use, if you're making money on your servers, if there is a money-making machine on your server, like it's a website for your business, I would stick with Kubernetes. And the biggest reason I say that is because I don't want to even have to run my own Kubernetes now. Like the clouds all do it. So I just want them to run it. And sadly, none of them run Swarm. So I got to use Kubernetes if I want to use Fargate or if I want to use DigitalOcean's Kubernetes. Yeah. So I am using Apache Kafka and Confluent Cloud and Airflow. Okay. I don't know anything about Kafka. I know nothing about Airflow. And Confluent Cloud, I've never run. So sorry. Not that person, not that expert. Is it anti-pattern to deploy things such as game servers behind an ingress with TLS capabilities? No. Totally do that. Do that all day long. Sounds great. Do you usually have a CI pipeline and a CD pipeline, one CDI pipeline and one CD pipeline, or can you combine those? It just depends on your tooling. So if you're using something like a traditional CI tool, the traditional CI tools tend to try to want to bundle in some of the CD stuff. And CD to you may just mean SSHing into the server and running commands like kube control apply or Docker service create, right? Docker service update. So you could do that. Once you evolve, you may decide, and based on how big your team is, responsibilities, is someone owning the CD process where someone else is owning the build and test process, which is the CI. You may separate those out. If you go to something like which I like is GitOps using tools like Argo or Flux. If you use those tools, they're essentially pulling out your CD and making it basically a robot that runs inside your clusters that checks Git repos for updates, and then it'll auto deploy based on the rules you give it. And so that is then splitting out your CD away from your CI. Now your CI tool can just focus on building images, testing them, and then shipping them to a registry. So I like that approach. So that technically means that maybe my preferred method is splitting out the CI and CD, but it depends on the tool. If someone was already using a tool and that tool had a lot of the functionality built in, I may be swayed to stick with what the tool they have, especially if it's a tool that's trying to adopt some of these more DevOps-y, automated deployment, rollback strategies, right? Kind of depends. I just started breaking from a mono repo after a GopherCon talk. Nice. Yeah. So if you're a Gopher, then containers are your jam. Like Go is a great language for running in containers. It's easy to build them. The shortest Docker files in the world come from Golang. they're like 5 lines sometimes. They're just it's a language that's really optimized for the modern way we distribute software. So it's pretty great. C# DevOps, you are most welcome. Yeah, and apologies. Yes, my podcast is on Spotify. Go check it out. We have not shipped an episode in the last few months, and that's because we're retooling our whole pipeline of how we make them to make it easier. It was too much work and too much pain to make them before, so we're going to do something different. But they're coming. They're definitely coming this year. The party seems to be here on YouTube. Yes. Yeah, there's not a lot of people on Twitch. I think that might change in time, but who knows? Could you not just skip traffic and use a surface mesh like Istio? Yes. If you're advanced enough that you understand surface mesh and you need it, it adds a lot of complexity. I will warn you. It adds a lot of memory and CPU requirements that you don't currently have. I will warn you. But it does give you advanced functionality, and it builds in some of these things like ingress. Now, Traffic has their own service mesh. So go check that one out first. They are building up this new tool that they launched. I think they launched it last year. In fact, I have their sticker. They sent me a sticker pack. Can I focus? So Traffic Mesh is one of their new projects, as well as Traffic. Well, this one's like, oh, my dog got this one. My dog got this sticker. So this is the little, I think is he a gopher, a gerbil? I'm not sure what he is. Somebody's gonna have to correct me in chat. I should know. I'm an ambassador. But the pilot is their cloud management tool, And mesh is, I don't know if you say mesh or mesh. I like saying mesh because if you're talking about service mesh, it's hard to distinguish the words. So I like to say mesh as a different. It's also the problem with traffic is when you're talking about ingress traffic and then it's capital T traffic. I don't know. Naming's hard. But anyway, this one uses traffic in the background, and the model that they use that I do appreciate is that it's one per server. So instead of a proxy per app that sidecars, it's one proxy per node, and it just basically updates its rules from how you're configuring the mesh. And I like that because as an ops person, there's only so much abstraction I'm currently comfortable with. And so creating an abstraction of proxies at every single container in every single server, when I'm really trying to get bigger and bigger servers, because you get better performance out of bigger servers, you get more network resources and all that stuff out of bigger servers. So I want big servers with dozens and dozens of containers, ideally. I don't want tiny little servers, because then they usually suck. They have very low memory, and most importantly, their networking will suck, especially on AWS. So I want bigger servers, maybe 10 servers that are really big, not 100 servers that are small. Well, if I do that, now I have small servers, but in a normal service mesh, I've got a proxy for every single one of them, and that's a bunch of proxies taking up a bunch of resources. I'd rather have one that's well written, designed for containers in mind, and like Envoy's like that, traffic is like that, but with this particular product with traffic mesh, or I think they're just calling it, they're calling it traffic mesh. Yeah, they rebranded a little bit ago. So traffic mesh there. I like that. So check that out. If you're going to look into service mesh, give that a consideration. I would, obviously look at the major players. Istio is one of them. And, you might like one model over another. I like easy. I want as easy as possible until I need to get complex. So typically I don't need the complexity of Istio out of the gate. I want something a little bit simpler and a little bit more, it's like Docker, right? It's a little bit more focused on the ease of getting started. And then as my needs grow, I might replace the tool. One of the things that we're trying to do with Cloud Native, by the way, is allow you to swap tools without a complete redesign of your whole system. That's what these service meshes are going to do for you, is you can swap service meshes. You can even run multiple service meshes. And it doesn't mean that you have to completely throw out the whole platform. That's what Kubernetes is going to give you. So don't be scared to try one tool, even go to production with it, learn things, and then say, hey, you know what? Maybe this mesh tool or this logging tool or whatever tool, networking policy tool, maybe that's not the right one for me. I'm going to swap it out. And yeah, there is a little bit of work, but it will connect with the rest of those parts of your puzzle. Whereas in the old way we did things, it might force you to change clouds. It might force you to completely throw out everything and start from scratch. So anyway, I do appreciate that we can try things and experiment and then swap them out later. Same goes for Ingress. Let's see. Sorry I'm behind on chat. We've been going a little bit over an hour, so let's see if I can't catch up. Can we bind SSL certificates into Docker containers like Apache, Nginx, HA proxy? Yes. You can do that. If you're only using Docker, you can bind mount them. That's the only way you can do it. If you're using Swarm or Kubernetes, you can use secrets to store your certificates, which is what you want to do ideally, is to encrypt them and store them in a central database, so that you can use it on multiple machines without having to copy it to multiple machines. You can easily replace it. And you can encrypt it on disk. So that's what those things will do for you. Can you limit resources in containers? Yes. What's your next question? You can do it from Docker Run. You can do it in Swarm. You can do it in Kubernetes. Just do a Docker Run help. Docker Run -- help. Yes, and Eric, thank you for that. I couldn't remember the command. It's Docker scan. Yeah, so if you're using Docker Desktop, you can now use Docker scan, automatically scan your images. Well, not automatically, but when you run the command, it will scan an image. And in the background, it's using Sneak. How do you set up startup order for deployments that are in the same YAML? You don't. You don't. In a distributed solution, you can't depend on startup order as the thing that is going to keep your app healthy. So a better thing to do is to look at the parts of your app and design them, assuming that you're the developer. You need to design them to be resilient. They need to do retries. They need to do buffering of, SQL commands. A lot of ORMs and different database drivers will do that for you automatically. But if your applications and your web apps and your worker apps and all these things, if they're not designed to properly handle a intermittent connection, you need to change your apps. Because in distributed systems, you can't assume the network is always available or that particular thing is going to be always available on the other side of the network connection. So maybe you've designed them so that when they have a problem, they just crash. Totally fine. When you create your applications in Kubernetes, you can make, by default, it will restart your app if it crashes. That's by design. And there's a back-off algorithm that as it crashes and it does the crash, we call that the crash back-off loop. Essentially, over time, your app will restart slower and slower so that it doesn't overwhelm your system, waiting for you to get the thing to come up. Now, you could build into your applications their own retries where they will wait and do that, or you can rely on the orchestrator to do that for you. But you do not want to I do not recommend things like wait for it scripts or anything like that sort of wrap around your application with a shell script or something. I don't recommend that. It's a workaround for a bigger problem that you should be addressing, which is in distributed computing, and if you're using Kubernetes and containers, you are distributed, your application pieces need to be able to have logic for when the parts of dependencies they have, the resources they need, when those resources aren't available. How does it behave? So I would look into that. It's a great question. You're not wrong in asking it because I had the same questions at first. The only case that I see depends on stuff happening. Two cases. If you have multiple parts of your app in a single pod, you can now control that so that the different parts of your pod, the different containers in your pod, start up. But that's not normally what you would do in a distributed application. That's usually when you have like a logging driver or a security thing or something that is based on, needing that container right there and they all have to run the same machine. That's parts of your pod. You can control startup order there now. If you're using Docker Compose, you can use depends on with conditions, which most people don't know about, but you can use the conditions option to say when the service is healthy, start this service. And what you can then do is add health checks. And I did that last week, I think, in this show. So if you watch last week's episode, I was working on health checks and depends on for a Docker Compose app. The reason that can work in Docker Compose is because when you're doing local development, you often are spinning the whole thing up with a Docker Compose up, and you don't want your app sitting there doing a crash loop on your local CPU, burning up your fans while it's doing this, waiting for the database to build, right? Like waiting for the database data to be injected or something. So you don't normally want that to happen. You want it to be a little cleaner. You don't want it to fill up the logs on your screen. So Docker Compose has that depends on there for you. And if you need an example of that, go over to my 2019 DockerCon talk, which is over here. So just look around, Bret Fisher, DockerCon 19. I have examples of how exactly to do that in that talk. All right. When can we expect videos on multi-stage builds in your Docker course? I don't know. For now, reference what I just told you, the DockerCon 2019 talk. That goes through step-by-step of multi-stage builds and why you need to use them and how they work. So go do that, Sudeep. What I don't know is when those updates, they need to happen. I agree. Those videos need to be in the course. I just don't have a timeline for those yet because we are behind on videos. So those, when you see, you will see the announcement for that either on my Patreon page, which is over here, or in the course announcements if you follow the Udemy course announcements, or on my Twitter, or in Discord. All those places will get the notification. Most people would miss it on Twitter, though, because I'm not one of those people that repeats my tweet 10 times in a week so that everybody can see it. What are the roles and responsibilities in a DevOps SRE team for someone who is just trying to start a new team? I would read several things. One, go read the DevOps handbook. All right, that's specifically about DevOps, not so much about SRE roles, but about the world of DevOps and how, and it's a little bit implementation based, so it will help you understand that. There's probably a better book if it comes specifically to the organizational relationships, but the DevOps handbook is where you start. When it comes to SRE, the gold standard on SRE, since it was kind of invented at Google, is the Google SRE book. So if you I think it's just sre.google. sre.google. So go there, and there's this entire book, and you probably will get everything you need to know in terms of reading. I don't know of a course on this, but that's a great question, and I would read both of those. The nice thing with the DevOps handbook is you can get it in audiobook format now, I believe, so you can listen to it in your free time, like when you're cooking dinner or whatever. I don't know if anyone has made an audiobook of the SRE, but they should. They totally should. I love audiobooks. Great question. When is Docker Compose going to be available from Yum Update? Dan, that is not happening anytime soon because that is a specific repo. So you have to go download it from the repo, and it's a special build of Docker. And it's just for now while they're currently testing it. So if you go Compose CLI, it's at github.com/docker/compose CLI. So if you go there, there's instructions on how to download the new Compose that's built into the Docker command line. That's the only way you can use it. It comes automatically if you have the latest Docker desktop. But if not, you have to download it manually from here. Now that's just for now. Eventually, once this is released into the production level quality release, that will be automatically in the Docker. So whenever that is, I don't know when they're going to release that. They're going to be working on it a while, I imagine. So Docker versus Kubernetes. That is the wrong question to ask. However, if you'd like, I have a blog post on it. Yeah, over at the Udemy blog, I posted a blog article. So check that out. Anu, I'm not sorry if I mispronounce your name. If the J is not silent, but go check that one out, and that'll educate you on the difference between Docker and Compose, Docker and Kubernetes, how they're similar, how they're different, why they actually are. You use them together. They work on top of each other, and it'll make sense. It's like 2,000 words. I recommend it. I spent a long time on that post, so go check that out. Run C rootless containers. No, I do not have any examples on that. Sorry, Chris. I would look up Docker rootless. Docker has a whole documentation on their website now about rootless and how you can run Docker rootless. I don't know. I mean, maybe 4 years ago, I experimented with just using Run C, but that's really low level and not meant to be used by a mere mortal. So I don't know anyone that's doing that. You could technically run containerd. There's actually a CTR command that will run containerd for you, but I don't know about Run C. Let's just say I don't know anybody doing that. Doesn't mean you can't. I just don't know anyone that's doing it. I was literally just now doing the K8 section of your Docker mastery, and I noticed the kube control run does not create a deployment by default. Right, so that changed in 1.18. So in Kubernetes, and you should see some notes either before or after that video that explain a little bit of it. But in 1.18, the kube control command for run completely changed, and now run only makes pods. So you want to replace that with kube control create. So look at that command. If you see the videos, they should have a notation that indicates the new command that you should try. But those videos are getting replaced, and I owe you an update, and I have not made that video. But they'll be replaced so that we are using the new versions. We kind of had to wait because this was less than a year ago they made this change, and we kind of had to wait for all of the things to get updated so that everyone was on the same versions. So for the time being, I just made notes in the videos and some lectures around the videos that said, hey, this is what's changed. But I didn't want to permanently replace the old stuff until we were all kind of using the same versions. But now we're, 120. This has been normal for a year now. So I feel like it's, and all the things you would be using now all have version 118 or newer for you to run. So the only people that are going to be running 117 are older clusters that have been around and not updated. And there are definitely those clusters out there, but I'm gonna change the course permanently so that we pretend that never happened. I might make a mention of it, but we'll pretend that run never did anything other than run pods, because I think I like the new way. I prefer the run command to just do pods. It's very easy to understand instead of the way it was using templates before, and I found that to be confusing and weird. Anyway. Hence, you cannot scale the pods. Right, there is no such thing as scaling pods. That's the point of running a deployment. So you would create a deployment which can have replicas, right? But a pod can't have replicas because a pod is a lower level object, right? If you think of the levels of abstraction, the pod is the lowest level abstraction in Kubernetes. And then on top of that, you add another level of abstraction and you can create a replica set. And then on top of that, you have another level of abstraction that can create a deployment. So a multiple pods would be multiple replicas, but you can't tell a pod to create another one of itself, right? Because it's a low-level object. So you need to manage that from a higher-level object. That's the reason we created replica sets and deployments, was to manage that. We created the replica set object so that it can have multiple pods and you can have multiple replicas because it has a template for those. But we created the deployment so that you could have multiple replica sets. And the reason that you need that is for rolling updates. When you are rolling updating so that you don't take everyone down all at the same time and you're replacing one container, one replica at a time, like that requires that you have the old replica set and the new replica set at the same time. They basically both exist in two different dimensions, and you're replacing one dimension with the other dimension. And that's what a deployment does. So look up kube control, create deployment. And that video is probably coming up next if you keep going. If you keep going in the course, you'll probably see that. So sorry for the confusion, but that is the things that are changing in Kubernetes. Our security guys are starting to freak out about containers running as root. What are the consequences of changing the containers to run rootless? As a specific user, I've not done it yet. Their complaint is that Twistlock scanner of running containers gives a very bad report. Every container running application running as root. All right, so there's two things. One, is your app running in the container as root in the container, or is it more about run C running as root? Those are two different things. So the first thing I would do, I wouldn't immediately go try to do rootless. I'm not even sure how well Kubernetes will support rootless, true rootless containers. I haven't looked that up recently, but the last time I checked, it was not well supported. So what I would look into is namespaces, enabling namespaces so that your containers don't run as the root user, and then also making sure in the container that you're using the user stanza so that your apps don't run as root, unless they have to, because an app that wants to run on port 80 has to run as root. So that's a problem. So you have to make sure that you're always using high ports, never anything below 1024 or whatever. So if you can do that, always run things like user node, user Java, like do all that stuff, right? User Ruby, user Rails, whatever. Make those users in your Docker file, and then go look up Docker user namespaces. User namespaces. I've talked about this. I've had Phil Estes, the creator of that feature, on this show, and it's one of my favorite ways. You have to enable it in your container runtime on each host. It's a host-based setting, and it tells that daemon. Now, the daemon still runs as root. Docker still runs as root. Containerd would still run as root. But when they spin off and create these containers for you, those containerd and runc processes will not run as root, and they'll run as a different user ID on your host. I bet you if you did that, that's much better and that's good enough. So check that out. User namespaces. If you just Google that for Docker, you will find ways to do that. Docker user namespaces. So this is technically still running the Docker daemon as root, but Docker now doesn't spin up all of its subprocesses as root. and in the documentation, and it's called username remap essentially, and there's a default setting, and it shows here how it's going to create a new user ID to run things under. And so I always advise this, and in fact, I recommend this for production clusters. Even if you don't have that requirement, I recommend you just do this. Not every app will work in this way. Certain apps with certain kernel requirements or certain port requirements won't be able to run this way, but you should try it, see if it works. And I would do that before I'd go down the path of true rootless containers, because to me, the word rootless means that the daemon is not running as root. And when you start doing that with Docker and Containerd, you do run into limitations, especially around networking. Now, one of the things that's recently happened is that we've got this thing known as cgroups version 2. And cgroups version 2 is maybe going to give us this world where we can do true rootless daemon and rootless containers as well. But I'm not sure the status on that. So that's a thing that just has been happening in the last few months as everyone is caught up with this new kernel ability of cgroups version 2. That's, I think, like the eventual utopia of that the kernel will allow regular users to do the things that they need to do for containers without requiring root privileges. It was really a kernel problem for a long time, that you just couldn't do certain things as a user. You couldn't create virtual interfaces or whatever. I'm not sure the exact limits, but that was the problem. Anyway, great question. All right. So I'm using a YAML templating with my stack file, but it runs the template itself as a service. How to stop? I'm not really sure, Max. The templates in Swarm stacks are different than the template support in Docker Compose, so it depends specifically on what you're trying to do. One of the things I recommend is that if you just join our Discord server, this DevOps.fan, and you join the Docker room, you can ask Swarm questions in there. I mean, Swarm is just a feature in Docker, so I didn't make a separate room for it. But you can join in the Docker room and maybe and show your example. Like, give us an example that doesn't work, and we can, people can try it, and we'll hopefully give you some feedback. So, what kind of K8's installation will we use in enterprise on bare metal servers, and how do you recommend or rate K8's managed services like AKS, EKS, JKE? I always recommend the cloud services. They will probably know a lot more how to run Kubernetes than you do. Just being honest. They got teams of people that are experts in building and managing Kubernetes clusters. So it doesn't mean you don't need to know Kubernetes, but it does mean that you're taking part of the responsibility and giving it to your cloud hoster. And in my experience, cloud hosters don't start offering public services before they have people that know how to support them. So I do trust them more than I would just trust myself, a single person, to be the expert on that cluster. So I always advocate for cloud-based and cloud-managed Kubernetes services. If you're on an enterprise bare metal, I mean, any of the distributions would be fine, right? It doesn't really matter whether it's bare metal or not. VMware is trying to create the entire solution that allows you to manage bare metal, VMs, and Kubernetes and containers all in one big, huge thing. Rancher will also work. You can use RKE to deploy your Rancher solution and use the Rancher GUI to manage it. You can look at K3S or Keys, which is a very lightweight, but it may not have all the nice tooling on top of it that some of these other ones have. Anyway, it's up to you. They all would work. There's nothing particularly special about bare metal. The hard part with bare metal is when you want to auto provision it, which can be challenging, right? If you're in your own data center, someone racks a new server, and then you want it to automatically provision the OS, install Kubernetes, add it to the cluster. Like, if you want all that magic, you're going to have to invest some time and some additional tooling that we're starting to see in the Kubernetes ecosystem. But that's not, I don't think it's fully fleshed out yet. But then again, I haven't had to do that, so I could be wrong. I do know there are Kubernetes operators that help you manage that, and runtimes that help you manage VMs themselves or bare metal resources, but I just don't know them that well. So this is about, you say it's easier to run Kubernetes nowadays because you can run it with other providers or in the cloud, but can you say goodbye to confidentiality or really owning the data. That's I don't know. I mean, you always got to. I mean, what does data ownership mean, right? Most companies don't have the people to run their own systems, so you have to rely on someone else at some point. So it's just a question of what are the requirements of your company? What are their data ownership requirements? If your company doesn't have data ownership requirements and it's not your job to make them, then if you've chosen a cloud, choose to trust the cloud. If you choose AWS, trust them. Like just get work done. Go do things. Now, once your company decides that it wants to make a data ownership policy and start setting rules about access to data, retention of data, or even specifically when you're supposed to delete data, that's a thing, right? Especially if you're like in government FOIA situations where you should only keep this data for this long so that we don't have a paper trail, essentially. You got to implement all that stuff. Great. That may force you to make certain decisions, but I don't. When I don't have those requirements, I don't necessarily avoid any particular platform. If I have those vendors and I trust those vendors, right? I trust AWS, I trust Azure to take care of my stuff. They both have good track records. But yeah, I still put in logging and monitoring and all those things so that I can make sure that things are taken care of. So I'm not sure really how to answer that question. But at some point you got to trust someone, even if it's just your ISP, internet service provider. You got to trust them to provide you reliable internet. So it just depends on what you consider ownership of the data. So it's a good question. I just don't know how to answer it really in the context. All right. Do you actually recommend running managed KAS over unmanaged? Yes. The loss of control plane and not knowing what's going on can sometimes be a blocker. In some teams, yes. I mean, if you have 3 full-time Kubernetes management team members, and that's your job, you've been tasked with managing Kubernetes, then you can run your own Kubernetes. If you are a single person that only has a part of your job time to manage Kubernetes, you should not deploy your own Kubernetes. Like it's just a matter of priorities and the cost to run it, because it's always more costly to run your own. It is vastly cheaper to pay for Fargate than it is to pay for a DevOps engineer or 2, because you need that redundancy, right? So for full-time DevOps engineers to run and update and reboot, patch, and secure and monitor and implement all the different layers of technology and know all the RBAC models and exactly how to make sure RBAC is not leaking credentials or any sort of security problems. Like to know all of that is a full-time multi-person job. A lot of teams I work with do not have those people. So I always advise for them, you run the cloud. The cloud's managed solution will be more secure by default than your part-time, just because you took my course doesn't make you a Kubernetes expert. I don't consider myself someone who could run Kubernetes in the cloud better than the cloud. I don't make that claim because they have teams of people that have gone through probably extensive experience, much more than myself. So yes, I do fundamentally believe that the cloud by default can run Kubernetes better than a single person. If you have a team of 3 full-time Kubernetes experts that have been certified with years of experience, then you go for it. Yeah, roll your own. Roll the vanilla up stream and make your own stack and go with it. You may not regret it. But most of the teams I work with, they're super busy. They don't have time or the budget to add a full bunch of people to their team just for Kubernetes. So they've got to make do with what they got. Pre-shaking. Yeah, so sorry. I didn't know if, Chun, if that question was to me, but I took it as to me. So, Dimitri, just completed your course. Great stuff. Thank you. Thanks for thanking me. You're running a stack of 3 node apps. Static bundles, and the download speed is extremely slow. Any ideas? Serves static JS bundles about 10 meg large, and the download speed is extremely slow. Any ideas? That to me is just very generic system troubleshooting. I don't have anything off the top of my head, but the first thing I would do is I run it. I take the exact same system and I run it on the native host. How does the download go? I run it then in a Docker run. How does the download go? then I put it in Swarm or Kubernetes or whatever thing you're using. How does the download go? Is there one of those things? If you're different running it different ways, does the speed change? And generally, downloading static files from Node is not slow, so that is concerning. It's normally very efficient. So I don't really have any. There's not a specific thing in Docker, but if you're downloading read-only files, right? Like you're just pulling them from like you said JS bundles. Then and we're talking about a server. Are we talking about Docker Desktop? Are you bind mounting these from your local host? Like all those things affect speed. So you need to give me more specifics, Dimitri, and you can do that in Dev, and you can ask other people and me as well in the Discord over there on DevOps Fan. Sorry, I don't have any better specifics. C# asks, what's the issue with networking on smaller nodes? Can you explain this? I thought that it's the more the better, and the better is the net IO load balance. So, for example, in AWS, every single instance you create has network speeds limits. The more money you spend, the faster you're networking, just like the more memory you get and the more CPUs. If you buy cheap instances, you get really crappy networking. Just go look it up. You will see the networking defaults, low, medium, high, and a lot of those are below 1 gigabit. Your own home network can go 1 big gigabit, but a lot of the cheaper instances on AWS do not. So what I advise for most teams is that you get a much more efficient use of resources and you get much faster networking the larger instances you buy. If you're a small team, it is much more efficient to have 5 or 10 large or extra large or double extra large instances than it is to have 50 medium instances or 25 medium instances. So does that make sense? So once you get beyond 5 or 10, there's redundancy doesn't help you anymore there because you're probably at most running in 3 different data centers. That's 3 different availability zones. So you want fault tolerance, and you usually want to do that in Kubernetes and in Swarm. That's 3 different places. So you do that in 3 different places for the managers or the control plane. And then the minimum is 1 node in each of those places running all your containers, right? 3 different copies of each container in a perfect world. So really, you could argue that 6 servers built up, nice and big for your instances would allow you to have 1 server go down, and you would still be redundant. So technically, you could be in maintenance mode on one of those 3 main nodes, and you could be taking that down for maintenance, and then one of the other 2 fail, and you still have this large instance running all your apps. So that's still, that's still a high availability. Going to 25 nodes doesn't make that more available because there's only 3 fault domains. So I tend to think in numbers of 3. So 9 servers would be a good combo. 3 servers running your control plane dedicated, and then 3 servers times 2 in each of the availability zones. That's a 9 server setup, and that way you dedicate 6 servers to just running your app. You're dedicating 3 servers, and then as your needs grow, the size of your instances grow. So you go from maybe large to extra large to extra extra large. But that varies. Some teams have auto scaling set, right? So they auto scale out and in on their nodes based on utilization. So in that case, maybe you are running medium nodes because you need to be able to scale out and you can't afford the cost of scaling out on large. And then over time, as your usage grows, like you get more users, you get more apps, then I would swap out those instance images, those instances that you're using from medium to large. And then when you do that, you get faster networking, which is what you need in a distributed system. So that's why I say that. Hopefully that helps. What programming languages are recommended for DevOps, Docker-related stuff? It just kind of depends. I would say whatever the team you're in is using. Python tends to be a choice that a lot of people like. My favorites are Node.js and Golang. So Go and Node. Maybe basically JavaScript and Golang. Those are my 2 favorites. Python has been around in sysadmin world and Bash. You could argue that Bash is a programming language you could use because it works on every one of the systems. So you could do those. If you live in a Windows world, you're probably going to be using Python. I mean, you're probably going to use PowerShell if you're in a Windows server world. So it just kind of depends. I think you need to be able to read Python regardless. Like, you need to be able to understand what Python is doing at a very basic level. You need to understand what pip is and how to install packages with pip. But you don't have to be someone who can write from memory native Python apps. Like, you don't have to do that to be in DevOps. I don't know that I could do that. Like, if you set me down in front of an editor and said, okay, write me a Python app without looking at the internet, I don't know how useful it would be. Maybe I could get as far as a web server that says hello world, but I'm not sure how much farther I could get than that. Maybe logging. I might get the logging right. I don't know. It'd be iffy. If I couldn't look at my old apps that I've made, or like examples, or Stack Overflow like everyone else does, I couldn't do that. But I do DevOps every day, so it just kind of depends. It depends on what you like. I'd say it matters which team you're in and what their preferences are. Each team has their own language preferences. Flutter macOS setup doesn't work. Okay, I don't know what that is. Hey AJ, thanks so much, or Ajay, thanks so much for thanking. I'm glad you're taking the courses, and good luck. All right, we're gonna wrap this up. Let's see who the last few questions are. The traffic character is a gopher, based on the Go Gopher. That's what I figured. Yeah. Thanks, Paul. Oh, Chun, been following me for years, for 4 years. Cool. Thanks. I'm glad I've been helping. Health checks won't work in Compose v3 anymore. Niels, guess what? You don't need v3 anymore. If you're on the last 6 months of Docker Compose releases, you go schemaless. Watch my last week's show. We are basically done with versions. You don't need version 2 or version 3 anymore. You can use all the features in your Docker Compose files. If you go to look at the documentation now, Docker now says in the documentation that the current version is Compose spec, which means they're following the new specifications that they created a year ago, and they've now implemented in Compose. That hasn't happened in Swarm yet. Swarm is still using version 3, but in Docker Compose command line, any way you use that tool, you can completely remove the version statement and use any of the features from the 2 branch or the 3 branch. It's awesome. Go check it out. I don't have any Elasticsearch. I would say just look at Elasticsearch best practices. You probably want to use as fast a storage as possible, and that probably means local storage, SSDs, that kind of thing, and giving it plenty of memory because it can be a memory hog, and then replicating it across nodes so that you have redundancy. Other than that, the Docker doesn't really change that for anyone, or Swarm. You just need to plan ahead for that. If you just spin it up and it's fast for you and you like that speed, go for it. It just depends on your requirements, really. You may not need local SSD. You may be able to use the in other words, instance SSD. You may be able to use the standard disks that your cloud provider gives you, but that just depends on your needs, and that's not really a Docker thing. Any plans on creating a course on GitLab? I'd love to do a GitLab course. I am not a GitLab expert, so I'd have to learn it to that level to be able to teach it. But it's definitely a great product, and I don't have any plans to make one, but it could happen someday. Can I comment on Django and K8s and maybe Nginx at front, asking because I cannot find much resources online? It would need to be a specific question, Hisham. I don't know what you're asking really. If you're looking for examples of those running on K8s, there are. I would say look up, if you can't find a Kubernetes template, which is hard to believe you can't find that. I mean, Nginx is the default ingress provider, so go look up Kubernetes ingress Nginx. Use the word ingress. Ingress is how you run Nginx in Kubernetes. If you're trying to use it like a proxy, if you're trying to use it like a website, then it's just standard Nginx. But with Django, if you're trying to run that, I would look up, Kubernetes Django Helm chart. Go look that up. I bet you someone's already made one, and then you could use the Helm chart to deploy your Django server. Which container is responsible for creating a router gateway and overlay network? That depends on the tool you're using, and I don't really have the answer for that. So it depends. When you say overlay networks, it depends on which. Are you talking about Kubernetes or Swarm? Are you talking, which C and I are you talking about when it comes to Kubernetes? Are you talking about Weave? Are you Calico? Like all of those have their own makeup and how they design their networking. So that would be highly dependent. Any tips for running? Yeah, I already saw that question. I think that's the same question. Yeah, you repeated the question. Sorry, my comment system sometimes repeats questions to me. Does the new Kubernetes course on Udemy based on the latest version? Manish, sorry if I mispronounced your names. No, it does not. It has the same 118 issues as Docker Mastery. It does go deeper into things like ingress and how to make your own YAML manifest files and how to do that. So it's obviously going deeper, but and it's got more sections coming, whereas the Kubernetes part of Docker Mastery was really just an introduction. So it does expand on that, but it is getting updated as well with the 120 stuff. I just don't have a date for us launching that yet. So, hey, I got another 99¢. Thanks, man. Thanks, Niels, for the super sticker. Appreciate it. Cheers. Thank you so much. All right. Yeah, I'm glad I helped on the C# stuff. You're most welcome. Thanks, Ajay. All right, so we're gonna wrap this up. What is my favorite pizza? Honestly, buffalo chicken. I think buffalo chicken is my favorite pizza. Yeah, thanks so much, Chun. I really appreciate that. Does my course contain topics on Ansible or Terraform? They do not yet, but they should eventually. I'd love to put some of that stuff into Docker Mastery, but they don't have that yet. That would have to, be a separate section, and there was too many tools in there already. I mean, the Docker Mastery course was so many tools. Hello from Turkey. Hello. And how do you become a Docker captain? Well, how you become a Docker captain tends to be you do stuff, you talk about Docker everywhere you can, you blog about it, you make videos about it, you talk at conferences, you run meetups, you do all those things, and then you get noticed by Docker, and then they invite you. That's kind of how it is. You have to do the work first, and you have to be super passionate about Docker tooling. If you're excited about Kubernetes, but you never talk about Docker, you can't get, you're not going to be a Docker captain. You could be a CNCF ambassador and talk about, CNCF projects like Containerd or Kubernetes or something like that. But if you want to be a Docker captain, you need to talk about Docker all the time in public. And then there's some new Docker captains, by the way, who are going to be on this show. And if you didn't hear the announcement, Nana, Tech World from Nana, or Tech World by Nana, just got Docker captainship. So we have new Docker captains. Yay! So I'm going to have them on the show here soon. Yeah, so I think that's it for the questions. Thanks again so much for the super sticker. I so appreciate it. Super noob question. Oh, you got it in at the last second, John. You got it at the last second. What would be some practical ideal case uses for using running any kind of Docker in our Kubernetes production environments? Everything. Everything I do is in Kubernetes and Docker now. Like I don't work with companies. I haven't worked with companies for 5 years that don't use containers. So I do multiple projects a year. Hundreds of thousands of people go through my courses, and we're all using containers. Every major tech company uses containers in their production. So I would say the better argument is what things don't run in containers. So container by default, container everywhere. You can run it on ARM. You can run it on mainframe. You can run it on Linux, any Linux version, any that's been made in the last 5 years. Raspberry Pis, IoT, they all run containers. So assume you're going to run containers. Don't think of containers as just some way to run an app. It's the entire pipeline. Docker has 3 major innovations. This is my final soapbox moment for the day. 3 major innovations, and there's 3 major reasons to use containers, or Docker specifically. 1, it's a consistent packaging format. It is the only way you can use the same file, known as a Docker file, to package up your app and all its dependencies in a single deployable unit for Linux 32-bit, for Windows Server, for Linux on mainframe, for Raspberry Pi, for all those things, but use a single consistent type of packaging format. It is the only single type of packaging format that uses HTTPS as its universal path for any operating system that we all use today as a way to distribute, right? So it's the new package format for the web. It is a superset of functionality of apt and yum and npm and gems and all these other things that are very specific to an ecosystem, right? The problem was before is we didn't have universal tooling for packaging up every app and distributing every app. Now we have that. I can distribute my SQL servers, my Raspberry Pis, my Ruby apps, my Node apps, my .NET Core and .NET Framework apps. I can now contribute. We can now send all of those out in the same manner with the same deployment pipelines. That's huge. That's a huge, huge deal. And then the third innovation was a consistent way to run those apps, and that is the Docker container. Now is a standard. So each one of those has now its own standard for how to package, distribute, and run the containers. And those three things are the amazing thing of container world. And that's the reason I shifted my whole career 5 years ago to do that, because I saw that future and I realized that this will be the standard. Like, we don't have a standard yet. There isn't a universal standard. The closest thing in packaging was npm, because it worked on Windows and Linux. It worked on Mac. It worked everywhere, and it wasn't just JavaScript. It could do binaries. It could do other things. But it didn't solve the universal problem. No one was using npm to package up their Java apps, even though you could. No one was doing that. So we needed this universal standard, and now we have it. We're no longer going to be shipping VM images as the thing. All right. So that's, pineapple pizza. Pineapple pizza is pretty good. So thank you all so much. I'm sorry if I didn't get to all your questions, Emmanuel. Come back next week. I apologize. I've just been running 2 hours now on the Q&A, and these are great, great questions. Thank you so much to Manvidar. Sorry if I mispronounced that. Thank you so much for your super chat. I really appreciate that. High fives, high fives. Thank you for that. You get the soundboard. Cheers for that. I really appreciate the support. And I thank you all for the questions. So I'm here every week. Come back next week. We may have a guest. We may not. And when you're not here and you want to chat with others about DevOps, containers, and all the things, go over there to the DevOps.fan, sign up for our Discord server, where we're doing some fun things. We've got some extra benefits. If you sign up for Patreon, you can do voice chat rooms where you could share what you're working on. You could just go live to a private DevOps community instead of going live to the whole internet. You could just go into one of the voice chat rooms, share your screen, start talking, and seeing if anybody else comes in to hang out. You could just try that. Some people have. So I encourage you to come hang out with us and learn with us. And I'll see you next week here on YouTube Live. Ciao.